with your sexual identity, there are just so many ways for you to come into it other than just having sex. You can like connect on so many different levels. And I think it was sort of up to me to go through that exploration of how do I want to explore my bisexuality? How do I want to have this manifest in my life, but also stay in a committed monogamous relationship with my partner who I love and I appreciate?
It's not easy to reveal to the world that you're a sexual minority. Now imagine you're an Indian. The stakes are that much higher. Dr. Varuna Srinivasan's decision to come out as a bisexual woman shows that she is not afraid to take a stand and voice her opinion. Her inability to find safe spaces to open up made her become a gender justice advocate and also build an online community to do just that, to be a safe space for others to address their sexual health concerns. She was named Woman of Courage by Serena Williams in Vogue Magazine last year for her work in promoting gender issues in South Asian communities. Not an easy feat. Dr. Varuna has worked as public health researcher and also for Doctors Without Borders and for Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and is currently a researcher at Yale University. In this episode, we discuss many pertinent topics regarding sexual and gender issues and the LGBTQ community. You wouldn't want to miss it. Hi, Dr. Varuna. Thanks so much for doing this on a Monday morning. Usually Mondays, you'd rather ease into the day, into the week.
No, I'm more than happy to be here and to be chatting with you. It's amazing. I always like to prioritize these sessions.
Oh, wonderful. It's equally my pleasure. So could you tell us a brief background about yourself?
My name is Varuna. I use she, they pronouns. I am a public health researcher and a gender justice activist. I am a sex educator on the internet. I have 5 years of work experience in women's health, in gender justice. I consider myself an advocate and an activist for women and LGBTQIA plus populations.
So, I've actually read that how you worked with Doctors Without Borders. And it was during such an assignment that you realized your calling about what you wanted to do to bring more awareness to sexual issues. And so could you talk about that experience? What was it about that, changed the way you saw things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that was definitely an amazing opportunity to, straight out of college at the age of like 24 to go and work in a really rural part of India, something that I, having grown up in Chennai as well, hadn't really experienced. I considered myself a city girl. I worked in like the bigger hospitals. And I had always wanted to work in public health. So I think I had always had an idea, I wanted to work with Doctors Without Borders. And so I was working towards it and I got a job there. And working with the organization, I would say you really do get exposed to the system a little bit more than you do when you are working as a doctor, especially in India. I don't think that everything is so privatized. So unless you're working in like a government hospital, you're not really coordinating with like multiple stakeholders. You don't understand systemic issues and how different things sort of like play into access to healthcare and sexual health education, etc. But I think that when I was working with Doctors Without Borders, it was such a jarring reality that the nearest hospital was 4 hours away. I had to coordinate a lot with like the government officials. We have to go out and do mobile camps, and it was just such a it was like an intense educational session for me personally. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that so many different things went in, that so many different things affected access to healthcare. I think we often have a black and white view of, oh yeah, India, they don't use contraceptions. But why don't you use contraceptions? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What is the family dynamic that's preventing you from doing it? And also working as both an obstetrician and a pediatrician at the same time, there is definitely a lot of reproductive coercion that goes on. I can keep talking, going on and on about this, but we often see in those healthcares that the father is an absent figure. Their burden is almost exclusively like on women to come and take care of their children. They are more involved. When they come in for contraception, it's only a gap between like two pregnancies. It doesn't seem like she has a lot of say in when she wants to have a baby. When she wants to have sex with her husband, if she wants to have sex with her husband.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a jarring reality.
That's true. And I think sadly, much of those issues kind of play out in the urban areas as well. And I'm sure you've come across that.
Yeah, I often, my husband reminds me that we often come from a bubble, like an academic bubble, especially the one that is filled with upper caste persons who have had access to a lot of like Western ideologies, that emulate a lot of Western practices and use it as are looking for white adjacent spaces in the name of like liberalism. So we often see like, yeah, I'm so like, oh, I come from a liberal family. My dad lets me go out to nightclubs. Oh, he like, I can go for a sleepover. But I think that, okay, like, so that's superficially liberal. But if you go deeper, there is definitely like casteism, this patriarchy. Like my own dad, even though he was like, you need to study, you need to go and become like, you need to be independent, and the women in our family need to be independent and earning their own money. But at the same time, it was, are you waking up in the morning and giving your husband coffee? Are you making him coffee?
Okay.
Like just listen to whatever he says. Like, just listen to whatever he says. Or we've all heard the sentence, do whatever you want after marriage.
Yeah.
Then you're not my headache, you're your husband's headache. So like it's the subtleties that we like ignore, but it's still like deeply rooted even in like urbanized areas, like you said.
Yeah, that's true. So, was this part of the reason why you took up, after your stint with Doctors Without Borders, you took up public health? You studied public health with Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School.
Yeah, that was also another like long-term dream of mine since I was like 21. I had spoken to one of the people in my community who like worked for Hopkins, and um, I had always wanted to go to college and study public health. I think so in India in med school, we have a year for community health. I think that was also like a first foray into like falling in love with the idea of public service and public health. I didn't really enjoy clinical medicine as much. I often attribute this as a reason for going into public health as well, and primarily working in sexual health education and gender justice. Is medicine is a deeply, deeply, deeply patriarchal profession in India, especially.
Could I know why you say that?
Yeah, in med school, like the girls' hostel had a very, very strict curfew, and they had three security guards. You had a sign in, but the boys' hostel didn't. They could come when they wanted, they could go when they wanted, they could have guests over, they would have parties. So it was, in a sense, contributing to the idea of rape culture.
Yeah.
Like boys could go and have a cigarette with their professors. But if you even heard one small thing about a girl, like if she like broke up with someone and she decided that she wanted to date someone else, God forbid, like words like slut or she's a hoe were thrown around, that she's not serious. There's sort of this other onus on women that that they need to be the healers, that they need to be in line, they need to be like perfect, but boys can be boys. Like it really doesn't matter how they show up, but they're showing, it's like the bare minimum for them.
Yeah.
But I think it's also a field where, especially I encounter this in surgery, which I know that across the board, so general surgery is known to be a very like male dominant field. Working in orthopedic surgery or like surgery rotations, my professors would text me wanting to hang out. They would call me in the middle of the night when they were drunk, and the excuse is always like, oh, it's fine, he really didn't mean anything by it. But it was never the assumption that, what if I don't like those phone calls, right?
Yeah.
It was always, oh, you look modern, you look like a girl like that likes to have fun, right? Like, so asserting yourself in a male dominated field often gets you the label of bitch, or she's arrogant, she has an attitude problem.
True. Yeah.
And I think that was it, definitely led to early burnout. I think that there was a definite like disdain and sort of like a negativity on my part that was like, this has completely put me off from working in clinical medicine. It's not a safe place for women at times to practice. And I think, wanting to work in public health, changing those policies, working systemically, and being an activist and having advocacy in every single thing I do, I think was really important to me.
You started your platform, of course, on social media. Why did you finally decide to do it? What gave you that push?
So I think when the pandemic started, I was feeling definitely really lonely. And I was like, I think all of us were flocking to online communities. And on Facebook, there were a lot of South Asian communities. And I was looking at sort of the lack of communities that really talk about sex and sex education. And I don't know, I like randomly was just telling my husband one day, I was like, I think I'm going to start an Instagram page and like start talking about the things that I'm passionate about. And he's like, cool, that's great. And I was like, yeah, I don't know where it's going to go. And I didn't think that I would get this far. Honestly, all I wanted to do was just share my opinions and sort of like, I think that the thing about education is that we often think of education as black and white. It's a blackboard and there's a very set curriculum and that the teacher has to present it in a certain way. But I think that's a fun thing about the internet is that you can really repackage that information in like an exciting way. And I felt like, given my experience, because I work in translating research into like health education, I work with people all the time where I'm like taking data from recognizable studies and telling them what it means for their health. Like I'm passionate about that. So I think it was just a synergistic moment. I don't know. It just happened.
So it actually progressed really well. Did you expect that kind of response?
I think I meet really amazing people, like even like yourself. The thing I do value the most is conversations and community. And I have so many new online friends, which is great. It makes me feel special. I think that's the thing that I prioritize a little bit more than anything else. I think everything else is secondary, and that's just come for me. Like, I'm grateful to the universe for that. But I definitely think that the more important thing that it's brought me is community.
Coming to that, I actually want to ask you, obviously, a lot of Indian women or South Asian women would have reached out to you. What were the recurring issues that you found that they kept coming back to you?
Also, the DMs I get are from men who say is like they're so ashamed of even exploring their sexuality. I think that was a very surprising thing is so many DMs that say like, oh, I masturbate like X number of times a day. Is it okay? Like, do I have sex addiction? Like, what's wrong with me? Like, is it big enough? Like, and I think that in addition to the patriarchy sort of like oppressing minority groups, it has also managed to make toxic masculinity thrive.
Yeah.
And I see that toxic masculinity because it's this ideology that men have to be presenting a certain way. And I think part of where sex education, the lack thereof, has failed us is not only in empowering women about their bodies and teaching men that women get to make their own choices, it's also telling men that like it's okay for you to like express your sexuality in a healthy way. It's often so unhealthy, right? It's often like, oh, it has to be 7 inches big and you have to be this player and you have to have big muscles. And, like if you are holed up in your room constantly masturbating, then there's something wrong with you. And there's also just so much of shame around that. There's just so much of lack of education around that. So that's honestly the most common question I get is about men asking me if masturbation is bad. And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. It's not, but I'm sorry that you feel that way.
And it's surprising that so many men reach out.
So many men. Every day I get at least minimum one, like maximum in a day, I have gotten at least like 10 or 15 messages from like same DM. I almost feel like they're in a club and they're all just asking me the same question.
But what about among women? Do you find any differences in the questions that are being raised, say, in US to compare to here in India?
So I think that Some of them do say that they have anxiety around sex. I think that was one of the bigger ones that came out on the other end, is that a lot of them have anxiety around initiating sex, about pleasing their partner, about exploring their bodies, about feeling comfortable with their bodies. So, like with women, I think that, or, not assuming that all of them are cishet women, but with women and other gender minorities, I think that the variety of questions I get are like, they don't know I'm trans.
Okay.
I think I'm asexual, I think is the other big one that I get, which is another thing in the Indian culture, or South Asian culture. There's so much emphasis on reproduction and like coupling, that when someone says that they're asexual, it's like there's an anomaly there, but it's not. Some people write to me and they're like, oh, I think I'm actually bisexual too. But like, how do you know that you're bisexual? I mean, I think it's just, there's just such a variety, and it's like hard for me to pinpoint one. But I think the big theme here is like exploration of sexuality, which is what I want to encourage. Is like the whole essence of education is curiosity. If you're questioning and if you are asking questions, that's great. Like you are on the right path.
Okay. And of course, as much as the social media has been a great place for this, conversations and forming a community, you've also talked about how this constant censorship, right? Which is kind of sad, because social media is a place where it's revolutionizing such conversations, where, non-binary people they feel they can be seen or heard. So how are you tackling that? I know in fact, you had to change your account name. You were South Asian sex ed to, now under your name, Dr. Varuna Srinivasan. So do you find that anomaly? It must be infuriating for you.
It's so infuriating. I think about this a lot. So when I had South Asian sex ed, my engagement was very low. I only had 100 people viewing my stories. And when I changed it initially to South Asians, so my name was actually Varuna Srinivasan before South Asian sex ed. And then I changed it because I was like, no, let this be a community and I'll just moderate this community. But when I did that, I was dealing with the shadow banning. So as soon as, I think it's the algorithm. So as soon as it sees like the word sex in a name, it it bans it. It's not like so when we say shadow banning, we mean that your content doesn't show up in other people's feeds, even though they follow you and they subscribe to your content. And if you post a couple of pictures that have the word sex, or you post content that has the word sex in it, in some people I know, especially for sex workers, have the shadow ban a little bit worse. And I think there was a time when Instagram was changing its policies. So you couldn't use words like menstruation. If you use words like sex, like that's it. Your content wouldn't show up for anybody. And I just had to make a calculated decision. And I was like, I think I deserve to have, like, I worked so hard at this.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I really have to take another path. But I think it's paid off for me because, like, on average now, like 2,000 people view my stories.
That's great.
And it's been rewarding in terms of like having people interact with the content, having people like reach out to me, create community with me. Yeah, I could definitely see that big difference. I was just like, I have to play the game. Like, unfortunately, I have to play the game. So that is part of what I did, was to beat that censorship. Sometimes I feel like I am shadow banned again, but for the most part, I feel I just had to change my MO, but the message is the same.
That's good. So do you find these conversations are actually translating into, topics to talk about offline, and doesn't just stay on social media? Like, when you encourage women to be curious and ask questions about their sexuality, do they come back to you saying how they progressed?
I got a message yesterday that said, hey, I wanted to thank you for your like story on like anxiety around sex. I felt so much better about myself. Or like, when I put up a post about boundaries, they say, oh wow, that you're leading by example. Like I'm feeling so scared to establish my boundaries because I feel people won't like me for it. In other cases, I think that one thing that I definitely stay away from is being any form of like a therapist, or like having a follow-up session with anybody. So for that reason, so when anyone like texts me back or like DMs me and says, I'm like, I take it at face value. I'm not really like, oh wow, okay, you took that one particular advice. because I will say that even though I'm an educator and I have the qualifications, like you have to question everything that you see on social media. Like you have to go and read and do your homework, and you have to cross check. And if I'm wrong, then tell me I'm wrong. I'm like a one person behind this account. Like there are like 7,400 people, and there's one of me.
Yeah.
And I use the free time I have after work or in the morning or during lunch to quickly look up information, consolidate it, and I do it for free. So I think that that's what I encourage people is like, please take it at face value. Like, absolutely, you must be following other people as well. Um, I constantly like to put that message out there.
I think what is also comforting in a way is for you on a personal note, you decided to come out last year as bisexual. What made you do that? How hard was it for you? Could you talk about that experience?
Absolutely. So I think that what we see on social media is sort of 1/8 of the journey, not even 1/8, 1/36 of the journey. And it's like really a superficial description of my own journey of coming out. But I remember calling my friend in 2018, in the summer of 2018, and like randomly calling him, and he is gay and he is a trans advocate and he's just for trans rights and he's just so amazing. And I called him and I was like, I think I'm bisexual. He's like, no, you're definitely bisexual. I was like, how do you know? He's like, no, I know you're bisexual. And he's like, okay, like, why don't you just tell me what it is? And I was like, yeah, well, I grew up like every time a woman kiss me, like, and I think that this is another thing. I think in India, like women who are with other women are fetishized. And even when we watch porn, like lesbian porn is fetishized. Whereas
Girl on girl action.
exactly, right? Now, that's exactly it. Like, oh wow, two girls are kissing, all the boys will suddenly start cheering.
Yeah.
And I was a victim to sort of like anytime a girl would kiss me at a party, I would like it, but I felt like she was probably doing it for like the hoots and to like seem like, oh, like we're at a party, let's get crazy. But like it meant more for me. And I remember talking about like, watching a lesbian porn really like does it for me, or I find women attractive and I'm like sexually attracted to them. And I think that's when I started establishing my sexual identity. But I think for a long time I was feeling really guilty because I was like, oh, but you've never really had sex with, like, you've done stuff, but you haven't had sex, full on sex. But I think that's also another myth, right? It's like that you need to have had this incredible sexual experience with like X number of people to have a sexual identity. Like, well, then how did I know that? How do most people know they're straight before they even have sex? Like, how do you know that?
Yeah.
It's sort of the same logic that applies to that, right? But it's just understood that the default is everyone is heteronormative and everyone is just straight or super straight for some bigoted people. And I think that from 2018 to about like 2019 was a personal journey of me reconciling and telling myself over and over again. But I had already met someone and he is straight. And I think then that was another turning point for our relationship where I told him that I'm bisexual. And I think that when you are bisexual, it's kind of like, oh, it's either or you're going to leave me for a woman, or, like I'm not going to satisfy you. And you're always going to be thinking about the women that you are with. But I think that with your sexual identity, there are just so many ways for you to come into it other than just having sex. You know what I mean? I mean, like, you can like connect on so many different levels. And I think it was sort of up to me to go through that exploration of how do I want to explore my bisexuality? How do I want to have this manifest in my life?
Okay.
But also stay in a committed monogamous relationship with my partner who I love and I appreciate. And I also joke with him. I was like, maybe the reason I'm attracted to you is because you're feminine and you have feminine characteristics, like, and I think it's also that. And so I think 2020 was when I posted it on the internet and I was like, this is my truth. And I feel comfortable with this being part of my identity. It's a journey. It's a really long journey.
Right. Did you ever think what you were going through could have been bi-curious?
Starts off like that, right? Like I think it often starts off as like curiosity, which is healthy. Again, like when you're exploring your sexuality, for anyone else listening, is question, am I asexual? Am I bisexual? Am I pansexual? Think about it. Spend time thinking. Like you start off in a phase of curiosity. And I think what most people are afraid of is like once they, that there's only one way from by like being curious is that that's your identity for sure. No, you can go back in the other direction. You can go in any direction.
Yeah, that's good you brought it up because a lot of people see sexuality as so rigid. In fact, I think it's actually very fluid, right?
Absolutely. And I often think, I'm like, am I pansexual? Am I bisexual? And like I think about that like a lot. And but that's part of it, right? That's part of my experience as a human being who is comfortable with their sexuality, is that I can feel comfortable. But I'm also like privileged, and I've created the resources for myself to explore that. I unfortunately don't think that a lot of people can explore that.
Yeah.
Which is, because we live in such a like a rigid like society that prioritizes cisgendered heteronormativity.
Yeah, whatever is considered the traditional way of, sexuality. Yeah. You also mentioned you come from a fairly conservative family. So how was it telling your family about it?
And I decided for my mental health and through going to therapy that my family was never going to understand me. And in the Vogue article, that they did on me, they said, I in the article it said that she's bisexual, and my parents read it. And they called my brother, and he was like, "Oh, she's bisexual." And my brother's like, "Yeah, so." He's like, "I don't care. She can do whatever she wants. She's married to her husband. It's up to him to decide." And then that's when I was just like, there's literally no point in me. I also think coming out is definitely a westernized concept. And I always tell people who are like, "Oh, I'm trans, but nobody knows," or "I might be gay and nobody knows." And how do I come out? And my advice is always, if it's not safe for you to come out, you don't owe anybody that truth. Anybody who isn't going to wholeheartedly accept you and celebrate you and create safe spaces for you, you don't need to come out to them. My parents were like, "I had to read an article about you to figure it out." I'm like, also, but you didn't create those spaces for me to come to you and say, "Oh, I'm questioning my sexuality," without you saying, "Oh my God, are you gay? Oh my God, you're gay. Oh my God." That's like, what about the family? What about William? What will people say? Right? Like,
What will the relatives say?
yeah, exactly. I have to go through so many steps before I hear you're my daughter and I accept you for who you are. And I just don't want to do that anymore. And I think that I will respectfully back out from that conversation. Um, so I didn't really come out to my parents at all. I came out to my brother because he's understanding, but not to my parents.
That takes a great lot of courage and strength on your part. So hats off. Wouldn't have been easy for you to, do that. And of course, did you expect the feature in Vogue to being given a shout out by Serena Williams?
Oh, I sometimes still think about it. I'm like, I think I've peaked in my life. Like, Serena Williams knows my name, and that's all I care about. But it's really validation though, because the work does really mean a lot to me, and it is exciting to me. And to have someone who is definitely a champion for women's rights, you know, profile me, I think that's a highlight of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the many topics that you like to focus on is also intersectional feminism. And not many people are aware of it. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So everybody has intersecting identities, and I definitely don't want to butcher Kimberly Crenshaw's definition. So Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black feminist.
Yeah.
And so from her definition, and my understanding of her definition is that, just this is an example, white women experience sexism, and like all women experience sexism, right? But Black women experience sexism and racism, and sometimes in situations it's hard to separate the two. So in a situation where they are dealing with someone who is obviously being a certain way to them, who is being sexist, it's hard to say whether they are whether their experience is entirely sexist. They also face racism along with the sexism. And in addition to that, I think the intersectionality that I practice is also saying that as a upper caste woman born into a Brahmin family, I think that my views can often be from a very, how do I put this, from a very privileged point of view. Like, I want to admit that as many times as possible. So what may apply for me may not apply for someone else. And I will never understand the struggles of Dalit feminism
Right.
and the oppression that they face. I think that I definitely face sexism and racism, but I don't experience casteism. I have caste privilege. And so that's part of my intersectional identity for me personally. And so that's what I like. That's something that I at least like to like inculcate in my page, is to say that, bring marginalized voices to the table, bring their opinion here, inform my work by Dalit feminists, um, and continue to read their work and intersect my work with their work. And I think that my job is also to take down the Brahmin patriarchy. I think that that's sort of the lane that I have chosen personally,
Okay.
is to question the Brahmin men in my life and to like call out the cishet Brahmin men in my life and call out Brahmanism and how it is suffocating. I think that the caste system in itself is a big part of why we have like gender inequality in India, why there's so much violence against women. And I think that you really need to reckon with those identities. I mean, just because I'm queer, just because I am a woman of color, doesn't excuse or doesn't take away my caste identity. Like, I still have last name privilege. I was able to immigrate to the States, like I'm able to run in particular circles. I had access to education. um,
Those are certain things, like you said, that comes with privilege that is not available to people of all classes.
yeah, I mean, in addition to that, I also have like skinny privilege, I also have fair skin privilege. Like I had access to education. So I consider all those like intersecting parts of my identity. So even though I say I'm a queer immigrant woman of color, like I still have cis privilege, skin privilege, etc.
Right. And, this conversation, this intersectional feminism, in fact, the conversation is often hijacked by Savarna women, women of upper class privilege, like us. And we are comfortably talking about feminism, but we don't often practice inclusiveness, what is happening with Dalit women or women from any other, communities. So how can that change? How can, women who have such privileges and who are so vociferous about feminism can be more inclusive?
Passing the mic and staying in your lane, I think, is one thing. Oftentimes I think about like what I'm doing on my page and the things that I talk about. And I often think, is there someone else who has said it better than me? And can I highlight their work instead? Is kind of what I think about a lot. Um, I also think that my lane, which again I have chosen, is exclusively to talk about, not to talk on behalf of Dalit feminists, not to talk about Dalit feminism, but it's to talk about Brahmin patriarchy. I think that, to continue to read and to continue to be in circles. So outside of Instagram, there's a Savarna rehab group on Facebook. I don't know if you're part of it, but essentially where Savarnas can be rehabilitated and can learn.
Okay.
But I'm still like, even though I say that, oh, I'm doing all of things, I'm still reading. I have, I'm like part of these groups. Like, my existence is still inherently casteist, right? Because I'm still like benefiting actively from a system. So like reckoning with that privilege. And I think the most important thing is also like rehabilitating your own family. Like, I've on many occasions, my parents would be like, oh, I'll call a priest for your wedding. And you would just have to outright tell them, like, Brahmanism is dead, like for me.
Okay.
The intergenerational trauma ends with me. I'm not going to be like, if we have a child, I'm not going to teach them diddly squat about Brahmanism. Like, they may not even take my last name. They're probably not even going to take my husband's last name. When having a marriage, having a secular marriage. So I think that at least that's something that I'm still in the process of learning, is like breaking those norms and traditions, refusing to take part in them in the name of, oh, but it's my culture. Oh, but it's a part of my identity. Oh, but I'm Hindu. And like, no, like screw that. Like, it's brought so much of pain and suffering to so many people, right? I don't see how I could possibly want to like continue another like generation of that. So that's personally my view.
Okay.
And I think my parents, like, they don't even tell me anymore. Usually they'll be like, Kovil Petuva, go to the temple. And I'll be like, who are you talking to? Like, I'm never going to set foot in a temple again. Like, it's incredibly like sexist and casteist. But that's just what I deal with. My mom got upset and she's like, are you anti-Brahmin? And I'm like, yes. Yes, I am. Like I also live 5,000 miles away from my family, more than that. So I can be brave on the conversations with them, but also to a certain extent, I'm like, yeah, I'm like absolutely anti-Brahmin. Like, we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but I think that I've learned to challenge them. I've learned to sort of sit with them and talk to them. It's kind of akin to like white people talking to their family about racism and slavery.
Right.
That's kind of what I think about it as. So instead of me jumping on the streets talking about like Dalit feminism, I think that there is a certain amount of work that needs to be done at calling my parents out for overly casteist practices.
Yeah, that's a nice way to see it. Have your parents been receptive? I mean, are they willing to, learn more?
This thing where they call the Brahmin priest for, and they look at this is a yellow calendar document, which I don't even know what it is like um they're still going to want to try and do a lot of these things, right? Like they're still, so like I think that with the marriage, I have been like, it's been 2 years, like it's been postponed for 2 years. But I think the idea where I come from is that I can literally be as stubborn as a mule, but we have to do this right. So like I went to them with an idea of a secular marriage, that I'm not going to do this whole like tali thing and have a Brahmin priest sit there, and we're not going to have ela sapade, and we're not going to like have most of these like kanyadanam. I don't know what all of these other like Brahmin. I may seem, oh, it's a traditional marriage, but it's also like really casteist. So like I think that's part of me going to them and saying, this is how it's going to be, or it's not going to be any other way. And then you're just going to have to live with the fact that your daughter didn't get a wedding, and you just have that, and that's worse for them apparently. So they'd rather like listen to me and do it the way that I want to. But it's been sometimes it's a lot of tension. It's like really stressful,
Yeah,
but nothing compared to what I think that Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi people face. Like this is literally like an aorta of the struggle.
I agree. Yeah. But since you like to focus on Brahmin patriarchy and how it's detrimental, could you shed some light about what has been so systemic about it that we don't even realize?
We definitely encourage everyone to read Suraj Yangde. He's a professor, Dr. Yangde, and he talks. And I think I've put this on my page as well. I would encourage everyone to watch the YouTube videos, but essentially his teachings are that women can never be free in a caste system. So the idea is that because of intercaste marriages, and I will also send you another website, which I thought was particularly interesting,
Okay.
is that what Brahmin patriarchy inherently does is that um, they restrict access for women. So, there's no inheritance, everything is in the man's name, there's no economic freedom. There's reproductive labor. So when you're married into a Brahmin family, there's this automatic assumption that you have to stay at home and that you have to take care of the children. Intercaste marriages, so you've already sort of decided that the daughter is going to marry within a Brahmin family and has to have a child in order to continue that lineage of Brahmanism, right? So that's like reproductive coercion, and the whole ideology behind intercaste marriages.
Yeah.
So I think that they really do restrict the mobility of women. I think that I've also heard many comments like, when my father found out that I had a boyfriend and we were sexually active, he was like, you've brought disgrace on the family, no one's going to marry you now. Again, it's like this whole like purity idea of purity, virginal and untouched, and that they are the pinnacle of, it's kind of like on par with Catholicism, where they like women have to be extremely like small and white and blonde hair and blue eyes and be like a virgin, and stay at home.
We should basically take as little space as possible.
Right, and I think that's the issue, is that I've even seen my mom go through that. But I almost feel like she has Stockholm syndrome, because when I try to talk to her about these things, she's like, no, 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 I wanted to take care of you and your brother. And I'm like, yeah, you did, but then you also want to study, like you wanted to do that. But then my dad was constantly like, and I love my dad, but I think that there are certain ways that he behaves that's like I really disagree with, where he says like every time she has a job, he tells her like, what will you do if the kids need you? You should be at home, you should stay at home.
But don't you think that has changed better now? I mean, it's not so bad as what it was in our parents' generation.
I think that, it's still rampant in some cultures. We've still seen that in Indian matchmaking, where they are very like, we want a fair skin,
Yeah.
skinny, but they'll say everything but Brahmin, knowing well enough that those features are very like Brahmin centric, right? Where when I also made a post about this much earlier on when I started, where um I forget the person's name, but basically the mother who's looking for a daughter for her son, he has no say in it. Firstly, secondly, she basically wants like a mule, like she's just looking to buy someone. Like she has these product descriptions.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is a human being, but she's like must get along with the family, like and she's already decided for the other daughter-in-law, like when you get married, they can have a child. Like it's just this really, there's no sort of like sexual freedom, there's no like reproductive freedom. It's very obvious that they want to keep these structures in place, right? And I think that's literally the hallmark of Brahmin patriarchy.
Okay. So I want to talk about, the LGBTQ community as well in India. I mean, a couple of days back was the, Trans Visibility Day. But, there has been so much furor about the trans bill that was passed in 2019. Even something like to show that you have transitioned to another gender, you need a certificate. And to get that certificate, you have to show proof of surgery, which is, of course, a fundamental, human right violation. From what have you seen or researched, what can be done to further their issues?
Cisgender person, I'm not sure I can speak on behalf of trans people and
Yeah.
what can be done for them. But I think as a person with cis privilege, I can say that we have to continue to advocate for safer societies and laws and policies that allow people, and also like this idea, I think that's part of like the educational aspect as well, is telling people that you don't necessarily need to have surgery or transition in order to be trans,
Yeah.
right? But that is still some what a lot of people want to do. So effectively what the government is doing is you're outing them. You're basically telling them that you decided you no longer want to be cisgender, so here is the punishment, right? So calling out those systems, taking to the streets, protesting. um I'm a little bit more involved in the politics here because I've been here for like the last 5 years, but like writing to government officials, working with nonprofits that have a little bit more of um, working with trans people. I think that's the thing. It's like listening to them. I follow a lot of trans people and I take their lead. So it's not really my decision. Like I don't make active plans. But I wouldn't say that I'm a passive follower either. I think part of my cis privilege is educating myself, educating other cis people in my life in on Instagram, reading more about the trans bill, looking at the ways that India has historically criminalized and marginalized trans folks.
Yeah.
What groups can you be a part of? Yeah, again, I think that this is, I India is just, sometimes I'm just like, oh my God, like and sometimes I don't even know what to think or what to say because the US is also no better. Um, it does make me feel a little sad because there are trans people still living in India. There are people living there, who are transitioning, who are afraid to come out to their families. And yeah, I'm hoping that, as a society, we can create better spaces for them to feel safe.
That's true. What about mainstream media? You think they've been more receptive about showing, such relationships from the queer community? Or is it still, you think it has a long way? I mean, there have been some movies of lately that have come up, but it must be a drop in the ocean.
Like you said, it literally is a drop in the bucket, like in terms of queer representation. But it's also like a really bad queer representation, right? It's like Dostana making fun. I was watching Kal Ho Na Ho the other day where they like, Kantabai thinks that Shah Rukh Khan and Saif Ali Khan are in a relationship and like they like really stigmatize it. I think that's really the word. It's like
Yeah.
she one guy like touches another guy and she pushes him away. I'm like, okay, that's toxic masculinity. You're like literally telling like this is so funny. I read a tweet the other day where there was a picture of two men like hugging or something, and it said, if you got $50 million, would you like hug this person and kiss them on the cheek? And someone commented and said, y'all are not homophobic, y'all are homochondriac. You are so worried that you might be gay that you have created these structures to remind other people that like being gay is a sin or being queer is bad. Even in watching like a Tamil movie the other day, I think it was Vijay Sethupathi who was a trans
Yeah, super deluxe.
super deluxe. My only issue was that is that why are you getting a cisgender male to play a transgender person? I think that's also like another thing is like, we have that's the problem with representation is that you're effectively reminding people that there are no transgender people to play transgender people when in fact there are. You would rather give cisgender people that highlight.
Yeah, I see that movie. And, yeah, while I thought Vijay Sethupathi did a brilliant job, but, this didn't strike me that, why didn't they hire a transgender person to play this role?
And I also think there's so much of issues even with the way that, like why was he also portrayed? I think that's another thing that we often talk about is like why when queer people or trans people are portrayed on screen, it's always painful. Like they're going through some incredible tragedy. It's never about love. It's never about joy. It's never about them having families and
Right.
showing that they are living true, full lives and that you don't need to necessarily be cisgender to have access to happiness. In that, I think he like talks about like having given up a kid for like to this dawn where the kid loses his eyesight and like he starts crying and this other person like chastises him and makes him feel bad about. I'm so sorry, I'm misgendering the character. Makes her feel bad about it. And she's just like, there's really nothing that I could have done. And I was just thinking, I was like, of the whole script that you could have written for one transgender woman, you wrote pain and suffering in that she had to do something so despicable to live and to like have access to life,
Yeah.
or because she chose to embrace her sexuality and like live in her truth. I think that's another problem with it as well, right? We don't see happy queer. It's always tales of suffering.
Yeah, actually, they could balance it out. Like, while I agree with your point, but far too many transgender people are from extremely marginalized communities who face harassment on a daily basis. So,
Yeah.
as much as maybe they want to highlight that, like you said, they could show there's so much of trans joy as well.
I mean, there were several things wrong with it. I mean, it was a cisgender person playing a trans person. That is also like the truth.
Right.
But it's also character. It's almost sometimes it's a caricature, or they make fun of them, or they make fun of how feminine some men are, and that they must inherently be gay. I don't think that. And also, like you're absolutely right. I think that if there are stories that talk about how the system has created opportunities for trans struggle, because like the trans bill,
I know.
people don't feel safe in these communities. It would be valid to have trans people in those stories talking about those stories instead of having them watch cis people make a mishmash out of it and repackage it and give it to them. Like that's not their experience.
Yeah.
So that's something that I continually definitely advocate for.
Okay. For parents, I've often come across, right? Parents believe that, if they expose their children to the idea of a family that is beyond the traditional family of a man and a woman, they get worried that, the child will start exploring, or we end up planting thoughts in their head that they probably will, kind of like pushing them down that road. So, how do you broach that topic for parents to their children where they can talk about it in a more inclusive way of what partners can look like or what a love can look like?
I want to say in a sentence that your child's sexuality and sexual preferences are none of your business.
Yeah.
It's none of your business. Your job as a parent is not to police your child's sexuality. Your job as a parent is to create a safe place at home that despite whatever they're going through outside, that when they come home, they feel safe, they feel loved, they feel accepted. That is your only job. And to provide the resources for them to thrive. Your kids are going to have sex. You might as well give them condoms and have the conversation with them. Educate yourself. talk to your child, communicate with your child.
Yeah.
I think that because we vilify it again, like we stigmatize it, right? It's the homochondriac, sort of like the Twitter word, but they are so afraid that it's some deathly disease that is incurable, and that, yeah, I mean, that's why there's conversion camps for it, or they take them to some priest and have them perform some puja so that, or say, go date a woman. In fact, I'd say that you are forcing heteronormativity down their throat. Like, you want to talk about influence, I think that's about influence. Like, you should never raise someone with a default sexuality. It's really up to them to choose. Okay, they ended up being heteronormative, good. They ended up being heterosexual, great. Ended up being gay, great. Like,
Yeah.
whatever. Like, that's what I said. It's none of your business. Their child's sexuality, none of your business. Oh, she's only 4. She doesn't know what she's talking about. No, she knows what she's talking about. You should let them explore it.
But sadly, not too many parents are, accommodative of that.
I guess I just have a very different take on parenting. Is my husband often tells me this: you want to be a gardener, you don't want to be a carpenter. A lot of Indian parents are carpenters. They all come out with these already like planned ideologies for you, and if you don't do it, then it's somehow the end of the world. But all of those are based on societal expectations, unfortunately.
It is.
And what worked for them, but it's not going to work for us. Like, we just had to break that intergenerational trauma.
That's a good analogy, by the way.
My favorite. I often think about it. Every time I try to like force my dog to do something, my husband's like, carpenter, you're being a carpenter.
So what are your plans?
I think that I'm in a phase where I'm not looking forward to anything. I think that I am taking things as they come. But I think it would be exciting to continue to put out some fun content and work with some really amazing people.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, this was a great conversation, Dr. Varuna. It was so wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me. I think this is a really like enjoyable conversation for me.
Thank you so much for listening. You can reach out to Dr. Varuna on our Instagram page at Dr. Varuna Srinivasan. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to follow Maharani Talks on your favorite podcast platform. Take care.